Today I want to tell a story about energy, and I'm calling this Canada in 3 stories. First of all, a lot of us aren't flag-waving nationalists. We're more humble about it, but even for those of us who aren't flag-waving nationalists, you've got to admit there's something quite powerful lurking underneath there. And so we find this in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup final when they play out Canada, it's sort of a catch in your throat. And then the real tears come later at the result, of course. Politicians also know this. They know that there's something quite tribal about patriotism, about nationalism, and they will use this, of course, in times of real emergency. So, if you're threatened by war, you will invoke the flag, and you will go to war and maybe die for your country. They will also, though, invoke it when they have a political agenda and try and wrap the flag around, the issue of the day. This is, politicians around the world do this. So who are we, though, these days as Canadians? I actually think that right now we're at a crossroads about this question. And some people are starting to tell a news story about Canada. And one of the pieces of that story is calling Canada, quote, an energy superpower. Now, this is a news story of Canada which has got a lot to do with oil and got a lot to do with the tar sands. And I'm going to speak today about how I believe this is actually inconsistent with a lot of our values that we hold, and also inconsistent with a decent future for our children. But the fact does remain that energy already defines us. Even before people were talking about Canada as an energy superpower, energy has actually underpinned both our own personal histories and also our history of the country. And so energy already defines us in many ways. And so we're going to look at that today through 3 stories. The first story is about you as individual Canadians and about how energy has actually touched your lives and continues to do so. The second story is about Canada to date and our values. And the third story is going to be about the crossroads we find ourselves at. So that's a bit of a tall order for 20 minutes, so we'll get started. So first of all, the first story is because we're a bit flawed as humans. We don't do long-term very well. We're pretty good at tomorrow, next week, next year. We're not that great at 2 years from now, and we're pretty lousy at 5 or 10 years out. Humans are short-term thinkers. We believe that yesterday looked like today, and tomorrow looks pretty much like today. So we don't actually have a great sense of our history, and we don't feel it at a level where it really influences our decisions. But we do, though, have access to a longer history through our families. So everyone in this room today, if you're lucky, you will actually span about 5 generations of history that you will directly feel through knowing your grandparents, knowing your parents, knowing your children, and with some good living, you'll know your grandchildren. So that in itself, if you add up the years that they're alive from the time that your grandparents are born till the time your grandchildren die, you can get up to 200 years of history then. So I encourage everyone, I'm going to do an exercise where I look at my family, and I encourage you to think of your own family as I do this. And the reason for this, again, is to sort of try and throw off those blinkers to say, what has been our history on a personal level with energy? So first of all, these are my maternal grandparents, Idris and Violet. They actually lived in Gleneath in South Wales. Whenever I visited them in Gleneath, I remember distinctly driving into the valley and smelling coal dust. So my grandfather was a coal miner. So this begins our energy story because he was directly involved in sort of the cheap, abundant energy revolution, which has really shaped our world and also shaped our personal lives. My grandmother, Violet, she began her life, her work life, which is called in service, which meant that she was actually stationed inside a very wealthy family to do all of their chores. This is the kind of thing today which is almost unheard of because now we have labor-saving devices like washing machines. And so it's only the very wealthy who actually do this anymore. So another indicator of how times have changed, you will not find a lot of people who are in service anymore, as my grandmother was. So she was born in 1910. When she was born, there was no electricity. There were no cars. There were certainly no airplanes. And so she experienced these sort of mini revolutions all the way through her life. So she died at the ripe old age of 95. She swore that the secret to long life was 2 things, a daily crossword and stiff whiskey. By the time she died, she had lived through one of the greatest energy revolutions that has touched people's life. Towards the end of her life, she could fly. My grandfather flew once in his life. But things have changed. Brings us to my family, my parents. They had my mother in 1940. Met my father, and they immigrated to Canada. So I asked my young son who this guy was, and he said, "Is that Mr. Bean?" The remarkable thing about people who have lived in the post-war generation, though, the baby boomers, is that energy has ceased to be a remarkable thing. It became taken for granted. People lived their lives believing that this was now normal. It was normal to have cheap energy at your fingertips, to have labor-saving devices. This was now background information. It just wasn't questioned. It was just part of progress. And so people ceased to talk about energy. This brings us to the present day. So I was born in Canada, met my wife, and 5 years ago we had our child, Oliver. Remarkable, I think, about our generation now is for the first time we're starting to question our supplies of cheap energy. So we are beginning to have these debates about peak oil. How much oil is there really left in the ground? And so for the first time, unlike my parents, we are now facing the prospect that all this cheap energy that we've gotten so used to, may not exist forever. So I'm going to risk a couple of graphs today, and the public speaking experts will tell you not to do this because there's an inverse correlation between the use of graphs and audience interest, and it just drops off entirely to zero there as people fall asleep eventually. Anyway, but I'll risk this one because it's probably the most important graph, I think, in the world. And this is the use of fossil fuels through history. So we can debate about peak oil, and usually the debate, if you actually follow it, is really only about 30 years. Like the pessimists say, we're at peak oil now, and the optimists say, no, it's 30 years away. But we actually look through the scan of history. It's a bit of a moot point. This is actually where we are situated on the grand scheme of things. If you take the year zero to be the before BC and AD, that's where we are. So we're, my grandfather helped dig up coal so we were going up that curve, and my parents also were there, and now here we are, pretty much right on top. Doesn't it feel great? We're right on top. We have cheap consumer goods. They're so cheap that you don't even have to, you can throw them away when they're done. You don't even have to fix them anymore. We have cheap flights to anywhere in the world. We have flat screen TVs the size of our living room walls. So this is what we've arrived at as a point in history because of the cheap energy. You will note, though, that the graph is looking a little precarious. If this was a roller coaster ride, you'd be a bit fearful of what happens now that you're at the peak and you have to roll forwards again. The other thing we've realized is that there's no free lunch. So digging up all of that coal, pumping all of that oil, we've burned it all, and we've actually filled the atmosphere up with carbon. You'll remember a couple of years ago, this climate change thing was a big deal. That guy made a documentary. Politicians said things like, this is the greatest challenge humanity's facing. And it just went away. Did they fix it? 2010 was the hottest year on record. It was also the year when we saw the greatest amount of emissions in the history of humanity. So we actually have not fixed climate change, despite the fact that it's no longer in the headlines. And so this is where the story begins to tip over from the present day and into the future, because energy and climate are now intertwined going forwards. So my son Oliver, in his 5 years on the planet, so this is what he's already experienced in 5 years. A fifth of Pakistan was underwater last year because of floods. 1/5 of a whole country. There have been 2 so-called 100-year droughts in the Amazon. Last summer in Russia, 1 million hectares of forest burned, and hundreds of people in Moscow died because of smoke inhalation. Today, there's a humanitarian crisis unfolding in East Africa. 10 million people are at risk, including 2 million children. The relief agents on the ground, Valerie Amos, was quoted to say, "Everything I've heard says that droughts used to come every 10 years, then it was every 5. Now it's every 2. This has all happened within 5 years of Oliver's life. And so I'm actually really quite scared as a parent moving ahead what the future is going to hold. Isn't there good news here, though? So we're at the top of this peak, so we have no choice but to cut back on fossil fuels. We'll be forced to actually reduce emissions. Unfortunately, that's not the case for 2 reasons. One, the atmosphere is already full of carbon. Scientists tell us we have already basically overshot the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere at safe levels. We actually have to cut that back. So we're not really allowed to travel the other side of the curve. The second thing to note about the curve is that it's all dirtier and more polluting fossil fuels. We've actually got the easy stuff, and now it's the hard stuff. So on this side of the curve now is more coal. On this side of the curve now is fracking for gas, which some scientists say is about as bad as coal for climate impacts. On this side of the curve is Deepwater Horizon. And on this side of the curve is also the tar sands. The good news is that the solution to both our energy and climate problems are to move away from this curve entirely, to leave it behind. I'll talk a little bit about that later. So we went through this exercise today looking at our grandparents and our parents because we don't usually remember very well, what it was like. And I like to think that if you actually think of what it was like for your grandparents when they were growing up, you realize that the past isn't necessarily like the future. That things are going to be very dramatically different for our children and their grandchildren. And that the decisions that we're making today are going to have a huge influence on what that future is going to look like.